our webinar series. Professor Sheen has, of course, got a fairly long-ranging and very distinguished record in terms of the places he has been to, the kind of institutions he has been a visiting fellow at. I will not take too much of time to detail all this because your CV has been circulated. But for us, it is important that given the kind of objectives we had for these seminar series, your engagements, your writing and your focus seems to be really fitting very well. And the few words that we spoke about in terms of what you will be talking to us about really makes it a very good fit. So we are indeed looking forward to a very exciting and interesting talk. This is of course goes without saying a very challenging time for the whole world, but in East Asia particularly, there seems to be a great deal of flux. There is a huge amount of changes, and very often those changes are not really easy in terms of 2 + 2 is 4. I mean, there are, despite the high degree of tension, despite the high degree of suspicion, despite all the complications that have been created by the rise of China and a whole range of Chinese activities, we find the process of engagement is not either halting, unlike what we are seeing between the US and China, where things seem to be moving towards a very sticky kind of a patch. Asia, and particularly in East Asia, we find that the process of engagement continues. And a great deal of this continuing of the engagement, continuing the dialogue, has to do with the way in which the leaderships of these countries are looking at the larger picture, not just looking at how it affects or will contribute to their respective national interests. So it is really how these dynamics from perspectives of different leaderships is shaping East Asian geopolitics. These are some things that we would like for you to look at. And so over to you. Without any more time, I would invite you to address our students and look forward to this interaction. Thank you.
Professor Sheen, we have, I have shared the hosting facility with you, so you could easily, place your slides projections. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. First of all, it is my great honor and a pleasure to have interaction with faculty members and the students from this JNU, the excellent university in India. And especially I would like to express my gratitude for Professor Sandeep Misra and also Professor Shubhani. Sorry if I pronounce your name, or Professor Akacha, for hosting me and giving me this very precious opportunity to talk about Korea's perspective on the regional order, and in particular maybe focusing on China this time. So let me turn into my slide to help you better for my lecture. I wish you can see the PowerPoint slide.
Yeah.
Excellent. Hey, as you can see from this map, today I'm going to talk about Korea and China, and maybe possibly some relations with Japan. But as you can see from this map, Korea at the other end of China. The India is at the quite opposite end of our Northeast Asia, sharing your border with China, as like Korea sharing our border with China as well. And as said in the introduction, everybody these days are interested in the rise of China and US-China rivalry, and what's going to be the destiny of those two powerful countries' relationship in the future, while we are also trying to figure out what is going to be our relationship in East Asian order and in particular with China. And often, maybe as you also being told, I got lots of questions from my American colleague or even from Korean colleague. What's going to be South Korea's choice in between US-China rivalry? And it's always difficult to figure out what should be our choice. And I think the answer is still is not very clear for everybody. Or do we have to make a choice? And to me, the answer obviously is I don't want to make a choice. We want to have a great relationship with both countries. But one thing I always felt like from the American perspective, it is very much like right now, the current issues. Of course, that's what matters most. But and also their approach is very typically, modern Western approach based upon this and that and pro and cons and rational approach. Whereas I think to explain Korea's situation or India's situation, we need to go also go back a little further than what Americans understand and think about China, because our relationship with China and this region goes much, much further back to like 1,000 years, whereas maybe that of Western or Americans, at the most, maybe it's just a couple of 100 years. In fact, it was like a 19th century that Opium War started after the British came to India and they advanced to China, and then that was the beginning of the West and in East met surrounding China, and in case of America, maybe even shorter than that of other European power coming into this East Asia, right? America was a kind of latecomer and participant in this great encounter between East and West. Whereas we Asians been living in this part of the world, again, thousands of years. So our understanding and our history is quite deeper than those of other Western. So that's it's going to be, in that sense, I'm very glad that you took this kind of much more long-term historical and the cultural perspective in this 21st century geopolitics of East Asia. So I'm going to share some of our Korea's perspective or history with this East Asian order. Okay. Today's, I believe that I'm going to talk about maybe 30 or at the most 40 minutes, and then we will engage in Q&A or any comment you'd like to give it to me. I will very much appreciate. So let me just go on with my slide. Okay. So this is today's Korea. As you can see, this right now, in fact, it's like a little past 7:30, right around this time in Seoul, Korea. If you haven't been to Seoul, maybe this would help you to see what Korea look like. Quite modern, as you can see. This is Namsan Tower. It's in the kind of signature symbol of Seoul. Which at the Namsan is a mountain located in the middle of the city. The Seoul city capital, Seoul capital, is very unique in a sense that we have a mountain in the middle of our capital. And on top of the mountain, we have this tower. It's like a Paris Eiffel Tower. It's not as much as famous as those other towers. But this is a recent kind of landmark in Seoul, in southern part of Seoul. This is a Lotte Tower, which is the tallest building built by Lotte company. And today's Seoul, this is one of the photos from our newspaper, English newspaper. And it is quite obvious what they are trying to say, right? Korea now, or Korean Peninsula, is becoming a kind of a subject of rivalry between US and China. But if you go a little further down to our history, this is our typical scenery just 100 years ago. The same place, Seoul, used to look like this. This is a painting of Seoul in Joseon Dynasty about 2 or 3 centuries ago. And this sound kind of a similar photo that we just saw from the Korean newspaper. In fact, this photo is from the American newspaper about 120 years ago. So New York Harper's Weekly came out in 1903 and 1904. And okay, in this case, the gentleman in Korean traditional costume, Joseon gentry, kind of caught in between the Japanese on one hand, on the other, this is a Russian. So that means, again, about a little more than a century ago, Korea was again caught in between the power rivalry between then the big rising power, the Japan, and or maybe one of the hegemonic power from Europe, the Russia. So it sounds and the feeling, the sentiment is quite striking to me when I saw this photo a few years ago from the some historical book. That was because right before that photo, Korea was engulfed in the 2 big wars, in fact, Korean Peninsula. This was the Sino-Japanese War around this time, 1894 and 95. Somehow maybe the internet is a little, okay. Oh, okay. And just 10 years after this Sino-Japanese War, we had the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. So that picture of Joseon gentleman caught in between Russia and Japan came out right before this Russo-Japanese War, published by the New York newspaper magazine. So, and now today, we are having a kind of very similar situation that in East Asia, there's another new power rivalry between 2 big powers. This time, it's between the rising China and the United States. So what does that mean for the Korean Peninsula, right? And at the moment, as everybody talks about, Chinese new assertiveness in East Asia with their rising power, this is some island dispute, territory dispute in this part of the world between China and Japan over this small island, Senkaku Island in Japanese and Taiyu in Chinese. And another, famous one is obviously South China Sea case. Everyone knows. And then, of course, recently we had incident in India and China border. So this is not maybe just a coincidence. So we all heard about this American scholars talking about this power rivalry in East Asia. In fact, I started in the early 90s. Professors like Aaron Friedberg talks about Asia is rightful rivalry. And then there's John Morsheimer from Chicago who talks about tragedy of great power politics, again, speaking of. And most recently, Professor Graham from Harvard University. Bottom line is, here in all it's very American's typical Western approach based upon what we call realism, right? It is all about power relations. Who got more power, whose power is rising, and who is trying to defend their position in this rivalry. And according to this Allison, the rise of China is a kind of, I think it's summarized in a way quite nicely. The rise of 5,000-year-old civilization with 1.3 billion people is not a problem to fix. It's a kind of condition that everybody has to somehow live with or manage. And this is a typical image of China today. And that means, again, it raises very fundamental and serious question about Korea's fate in between those power rivalry, especially Korea right now caught in between those United States and rising China. But then some interesting alternative approach on all this East Asian geopolitics and Korea and China and other is provided by people like David Kahn. He is a professor at the USC, and he came up with a kind of unorthodox constructivist approach based upon his interpretation or understanding of long history in East Asian part. So this power-based realism would not, cannot explain everything. Maybe it is too a simplistic approach. Maybe we got to understand much more deeper issues like culture and history in East Asia that goes much far long way back to thousands of these dynamics in this part of the world. And so he talks about hierarchy, and which was, by the way, one of the reading list I gave to this lecture. And he tried to say that the Asian order is quite interesting in a sense that it's not all about power. It's also more about hierarchy, but that hierarchy is not just a kind of only the strong takes everything from the weak. It is much more harmonious in a way, quite a long time of this period. At the same time, it's not just a completely, the powerful country only dominate the small power. There was a more kind of mutual respect or coexistence between those countries. Of course, still centered around the China-centric order in this part of the world. Of course, depending on, other people can always raise a question about his approach, and he would not say that he is the one who explained everything, but he tried to, still bring us some kind of new perspective other than just a power-based realistic approach. And I think his approach, gives us kind of a quite interesting segue for us to understand not only the past, but also even the current situation dynamics and bilateral relations in East Asia between those countries. And in particular, in this case, I think what would be the interesting aspect of Korea-China's relations. So this is just my way of introducing different kind of approach. And then what David Kahn talks about, if I use his framework into the Korea-China relation in historical perspective, again, we, at least each of our countries in this region say our history goes back 2,000 years, if not 5,000 years, right? And there are a few cases that I can tell you about Korea's relations with China. 4th century in East Asia, this was like a Korean peninsula. We had 3 kingdoms. One is Goguryeo and Baekje and Silla. And there's a various dynasty existed in Chinese mainland. But then, yes, this Goguryeo, Baekje, Silla had a quite extensive exchange with mainland Chinese culture and civilization. As you can see from this photo, there's a lot of kind of resemblance in terms of their costume and simply the painting itself some kind of very similarity between that of China and Korea. And in fact, geographically, since Korea was right next to China, there has been lots of exchange between those three kingdoms in Korean Peninsula and then various dynasties in China. And it was a kind of very dynamic and complex web of alliance or balancing or checking rivalry. And and they're changing partnership at once from one way or the other. And bottom line was there was a great exchange was going on between this Chinese part of the world and Korea's three kingdoms. And in between, eventually those used to be the smallest kingdom in those Korean Peninsula, end up with uniting these three kingdoms into a one Korea, one of the key major events on the Korean Peninsula. At that time, obviously, the Tang Dynasty in mainland China played a very important role in this unification process. They changed the alliance partnership from Baekje to Shilla, and with the Tang, alliance with the Tang, Shilla could overcome the biggest powerhouse, Goguryeo, and later Baekje. So bottom line is Korea-China relationship, again, the geopolitical rivalry or this power transition goes much way back than this 20th century or 21st century power transition in East Asia today. Again, fast forward, after the Shilla dynasty, we had a new dynasty, Goryeo, coming into this Korean peninsula sometimes in the 10th century. And then in Chinese mainland, there was a Song dynasty. And Goryeo and Song used to have a very good relations, again. And this is a Goryeo dynasty. This is a statue of that founding father of Goryeo, Wangun. There's no way that this is a real Wangun, but anyway, this is supposed to be his statue. And then there's a rise of a new empire. It's called Won under this Genghis Khan. And with that changing power relations in the mainland China, this rising new empire again conquered the mainland Chinese, and then they invaded Goryeo dynasty. So we call it Mongol invasion of Goryeo in 13th century. And this is again some paintings from those period. And then the fall of Goryeo was followed by the rise of Joseon, the last dynasty on the Korean Peninsula before modern Korea, which lasted about 500 years, one of the longest surviving single dynasty on the Korean Peninsula at least, or in the world. And then we had this Ming dynasty, Joseon's counterpart in Chinese mainland. And they had, again, good partnership for like centuries of relations. And then in between, there was a rise of Japan and Japanese invasion of Joseon in the late 16th century. And this is Japanese new Lord Hideyoshi. And he decided to, the interesting thing was, even though it was the Korean Peninsula, Joseon became a main victim of this rising new hegemonic power in Japan. In fact, original motivation or reason why the Japan wants to come to Joseon was not about Joseon. They wanted to take on Ming. So Hideyoshi offered a kind of partnership to Joseon dynasty, saying that let's make an alliance partner, and if you help me, I'm going to take on Ming, and then we can, establish a very strong alliance, right? Of course, Joseon said no, because Joseon had such a strong partnership with Ming, and Joseon used to always look down on this Japan as a kind of barbarian nation. So they said no, and then Japan said, okay, if that's the case, I have no other choice but to first invade Joseon so that we can go to Ming. And this is some photo painting from those Japanese coming into the shore of Busan, southern port city of Korea. And then we had this amazing hero, the Admiral Lee, with his great invention of this turtle ship. So that's why he used to be on one of our national currency, as a national hero. But the interesting dynamics again is the Ming was not just sitting idle. They came to help Joseon, their key ally. The emperor of Ming, the Wali, sent out his Ming troops to Joseon to defend, fight against the Japanese, invading Japanese together, which they did. They fought back against this Japanese, and Japanese went back. Again, right, just 30-something years after the Japanese invasion of Joseon and Ming, Joseon had to go through another great disaster. There was they got attacked, invasion from the northern China. At the time, it was Manchu, early 17th century. Then the Manchu leader Hong Taiji, again, pretty much asked the same thing to the Joseon dynasty, saying that I'm going to take Ming, so please, you change the alliance partnership with me instead of Ming. Of course, this was just 30 years after Ming saved Joseon from the Japanese invasion. They could not say yes to this Manchu. The result, outcome was this Manchu invaded Joseon first before they take on Ming. So this was the map of those times, this rising new Manchuria. To take on Ming, they had to take care of Joseon first. And this was another painting from those area. Error. So here's one interesting observation. First of all, the thing is, I only talk about this great war surrounding the Korean Peninsula, right? And each time Korea became a victim of these great powers, right? Once one dynasty, empire, or the Tang dynasty, or the Manchu, or Japan. But if you think about it clearly, this period of this invasion took over how many years? How long a part of history in the Korean Peninsula? This was almost happening in over 2,000 years. In those 2,000 years, how many major invasions by those countries? 4 war, right? For over 2,000 years, Korea had, of course, in between there are small scale, kind of war with the neighboring country, but this kind of big, seminal war on the Korean Peninsula happened only 4 or 5 times. In particular, if you think about the Joseon dynasty, throughout its 500 years, we had 2 wars. First was the Japanese invasion again. The second followed by the Manchu invasion. So during the 500 years of Joseon history, we only had 2 invasions, right? Of course, the Koreans ourselves only remember those 2 wars. So we hate Japanese. Sorry to say that, simply speaking, lots of Koreans today still have very bad feeling. Of course, later they colonized us. That is a much direct reason about this historical animosity between Korea and Japan. But then still, yes, the Hideyoshi invasion is also taught very in detail in Korean school. So Koreans doesn't have a very good feeling toward the Japanese, but think about it, it's just 500 years, only once or twice. Even China, the thing is only once. And second of all, in case of the Japanese first invasion, we fought back, they went back to Japan. In case of Manchu invasion, after they defeated Joseon and they got a surrender from the Joseon king, they didn't try to colonize Korea, or they didn't try to occupy Korea. Of course, they wanted to have, you know, Korean loyalty to them. But then once they got this loyalty from Korean Joseon dynasty, they just left. So there's no, so all in all, the thing is, even though Joseon, Korea was living right next to giant China for how many more than 1,000 years, there has never been a kind of such a direct clash between Chinese dynasty and the Korean dynasty. Those clash only happen when there is a major, yes, power transition on the mainland. And even in that case, once they got a promise from the Joseon kingdom, say that we are going to, you know, pay the respect and loyalty, then they just left. They didn't do anything much. Of course, in between, since then, there has been a kind of a tributary system. We send a delegate to the capital of China and we pay the respect, but that's it. Other than that, they didn't send out their own colonial master, or they didn't try to intervene in domestic affairs of Joseon, right? So this is a kind of interesting aspect of East Asian order before pre-modern period, that mostly the East Asian order was quite stable with peaceful relation, especially in compared to Western order in the similar period. If you think about, you know, after Middle Age and after Middle Age in European affairs, there was a ongoing war between the major countries, right? And they were fighting against each other. And especially if you come to compare it to the 17th and 18th century and 19th century, the great power politics in the European continent, there's always ongoing war among the great power in Europe, and then the small power among those great powers always became a victim of great power rivalry. Whereas in case of East Asia, it was relatively stable and peaceful, as long as they paid the respect to each other. So that's what David Kang tried to say. And whether that could translate, have a certain impact on the today's partnership or relationship in East Asia. And he even goes on to say quite boldly, saying that no, China becoming strong doesn't relatively necessarily mean that China will try to dominate every other country. Maybe China, the stronger China would be more beneficial to East Asian order. He even goes to, it was the China when it was very unstable, then there was always chaos and some kind of disruption happened, some part of East Asia. And then he said, as long as that's the case, US trying to contain Asia will, left alone. US will be the odd man out in East Asia in trying to contain China. I don't necessarily agree with all the argument made by David Kang. But at the same time, there are certain anomaly that cannot be explained by the Western, the rational or realist-based approach in trying to understand some East Asian behavior. For whatever reason, for example, Japan, obviously in this part of the world, Japan has certain obviously anxiety and very serious concern about rising Chinese power. And I think they have a good reason to do so. Simply think about the past 100 years ago, what happened, what Japan did to China, right? Whereas in case of South Korea or Korea, I mean, the Korea itself is divided into two Korea today. That makes our case much more tricky and complicated. But North Korea being a close ally of China is one thing, but South Korea, what would be the South Korean view of China? Of course, we also are very much aware of China's growing power. And when China does something kind of bullying activity, such as like over SAT, missile diplomacy, and then the public sentiment about China goes down and they they very much critical of Chinese assertive behavior and all that. But at the same time, not only Korean economy is becoming very much dependent upon or integrated into Chinese economy, but also Korean public perception, unless China does very kind of aggressive behavior, in general, Korean view of China is not like very much, we feel like China is rising power is threatening to Korea's national security. Maybe one could say we, because of in between we have North Korea. But anyway, obviously the Korean attitude or perception toward China is quite different from that of Japan, I should say, or more complicated from that of Americans or Western society. So maybe this much longer history called legacy between Korea, China maybe plays into that kind of interesting dynamics. We can talk about it later on. That's the, by the history part. I know my time is coming up. I will try to finish rest of my lecture in about 10 minutes. Let me talk a little bit about the current issues under this historical background. And again, coming back to this, fast forward to the current situation in the Korean Peninsula. And right now, one thing is that, which is not only good, not good news maybe for Korea, that is, there's another fundamental power transition is happening on the Korean, surrounding the Korean Peninsula. Or it already has happened, right? If your past history is any guide, whenever there is a big power transition surrounding the Korean Peninsula, not because of us, but somehow Korea got sucked into this power rivalry, right? In those Japanese invasion of China, this Manchu invasion of Joseon, and of course, in the late 19th century, the Japanese trying to take on China. In that process, they went to war with Qing, and they went to war with Russia. It is called the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. But where they fought on the Korean Peninsula. Korea has become a battleground for those great power rivalry. So that means even though Korea is not a direct subject of those great powers, aggression or conquest, but because of geography, Korea has been always kind of become a kind of subject of this great power rivalry. That means we got to be very, very careful whenever that happens. And to me, the bad news is it is happening right now. Since when? Since last war on the Korean Peninsula. That means what? That was the rise of Japan as the #1 in Asia. Last time that happened, right? Why? Because the Japanese Empire defeated the Qing Empire. Then Japan has become the #1 power in Asia, at least. Of course, that made Japan is too much ambitious. They took on, tried to take on America, and they got into this Pacific War. They got defeated. But still, after Pacific War, what has happened? Japan rebuilt its economy, and Japanese economy has become the #2 in the world. #2 in the world means #1 in the world, right? In Asia. And that was the case until when? Officially, according to IMF, World Bank, until 2010. That was the time when Chinese GDP officially took over that of Japan in 2010. And around that time, I was talking about all this power rivalry in the past history. And I was telling my Korean colleague, Korea got to be very, very careful again. It is happening again in a century. This kind of change in #1 and #2 position, in at least in Northeast Asia, doesn't happen every 10 years or every 20 years or every half century. It happens maybe between centuries, and it happens more than centuries ago, and now it is happening again right now in front of us. So that Korea got to be very careful. I was telling this story to my fellow already 10 years ago. And see what's happening today. This is not just a coincidence, I think, or by accident. And I think what we are witnessing between US and China and Japan and Southeast Asia, or all that, is a kind of this impact of this power transition that is happening in this part of the world with rise or real rise of China, what they call, right? What does that mean? Yes, there's an arms race going on in this part of the world. Everybody is spending their money, and Korea is becoming suddenly, not suddenly, but newly, quite Americans are very much interested in Korean Peninsula for obvious reason. Used to be Korea, US military in Korea was against the Soviet army and North Korean invasion. But now what? Guess what? I obviously think there's another new mission for American military on the Korean Peninsula these days, right? Although those, that is not the official language of any of two governments. But at the same time, there's a deepening partnership between China, regardless of Korean administration. This is previous government, Park Geun-hye, who used to be very conservative, represent very right-wing conservative faction of South Korean politics. This is our current government, President Moon Jae-in, who also represent opposite, the progressive, faction of Korean politics. But regardless of their ideology or political orientation, one common element is both of these two leaders wants to build a good relations with Chinese. But then again, China has a very interesting place that so far China is the only major country in this part of the world that has a diplomatic relation, formal diplomatic relation with both Korea. Of course, Russia may have it, but Russia is not such a prominent figure in geopolitics today. Japan does not have it. US does not have it, right? So China can always play these two Koreas at the same time, depending on their own national interest, of course. And yes, last year, Xi Jinping visited Pyongyang in just how many long time there has no such a kind of state visit by any Chinese leader to North Korea before. But it happened last year. So the South Korea is right now is surrounded by, again, these big powers, China, US and Japan and Russia and North Korea. And these countries represent quite big challenge for Korea's diplomacy. So we are talking about middle power diplomacy and all that. South Korea these days quite strong in economically and militarily. So we used to call ourselves as a shrimp between whales in our Korean proverb. But no, maybe one could say, no, Korea is not shrimp anymore. Maybe we could be a dolphin, if not a whale. So that's a kind of thing. But still, let alone day-to-day operation on the US-China and US-Korea, Korea-Japan, inter-Korean relations. One thing is that in the long term, if you look at this historical path of the Korean Peninsula, Korea and the two Koreas at the crossroads at the moment. So let me stop here. And then if there is, I have some more photos, but I think I have spoken enough. So if you have any question or comment, I will be more than happy to answer and discuss it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Professor Sheen. I think there was somebody's got their audios on, so please mute yourselves. There is a interference. Okay, thank you very much. So Professor Sheen, that was indeed very, very thought-provoking and very interesting talk that you gave us, and I particularly like the way in which you blended both. There, somebody please switch off your audio. All your
like I can do that. Oh,
no,
I
not
did
you,
that.
not you. There were some people. I think some
Yeah,
of the
yes.
audience
Yeah,
got that.
right.
So yeah, so it was coming in, right. I was saying that I particularly appreciated the manner in which you blended a historical perspective with the contemporary complex dynamics, complex diplomacy, as you put it, that Korea is looking at. And I think for our students, it is important to understand um, how significant it is to understand a state or a people's past experience or history, and particularly what is the perception of that history. So it's one thing for Indian students to read about Korean history, but to listen to a Korean scholar giving his perception of that history, that I think is very is literally central to the way in which we will try and understand how and why a particular state or a particular set of people or leaders adopt certain ideas, certain beliefs. And I think the importance of historical factors has very well been brought up by you, because very often we become victims of very judgmental approaches, and something like the importance of bringing in cultural relativism in our study of a country. So I think that was something that came out very well in your talk, and I'm sure our students have benefited. And the other part, of course, the manner in which you have explained how Korea has always been caught in between the rivalry and the conflict and the games that larger states play. So the dilemma of small states and how do they position themselves, particularly when these small states are not quite just small in terms of their actual weight. The economic weight of Korea is obviously something that is very significant in Asia, certainly, but also in the world economy. So I think all these things have come out very well, and particularly when you concluded on how the engagement is, despite all the pluses and minuses, pros and cons, the movement of the engagement is continuously is going forward. And I think that's something that we really need to grasp and understand. So thank you very much for that, and I'm sure there will be questions, there will be comments, and so Shrabani, how do we want to do this? Shall we just, because in the chat I noticed that there are no questions, but oh yes, okay.
Yeah.
So faculty,
There's a question.
There is one question. So Sudhakar, why don't you speak it out instead? You've written it out, but maybe you can come in. So I will give the floor to Sudhakar to ask, make his point first.
Yes, please ask, tell your question. Ask.
Yeah, Professor Sheen, it was very, very interesting presentation. You have covered a lot of things, particularly the historical rivalry which is happening on the Korean Peninsula. It's a very long time. Even it is continuing even in the present context as well. I have a question. See, as in your talk, you were talking about North Korea has no problem with Chinese domination in the region, right? But if that is the case, why North Korea is hesitating to join with China with the BRI initiative, that is, Belt and Road Initiative? Perhaps we can see, there is a context of Korean nationalism, because Korea, they don't like anybody's domination because they've already been a victim in this great power rivalry. So I want your insight on that.
Yes, thank you very much for your very interesting question, which is also very relevant for the current situation in the two Koreas. The first about North Korea and China relation. One kind of puzzle is that despite the fact that everybody understand North Korea and China has a kind of strategic interest in still continuing their alliance partnership, although that alliance partnership is in itself is very much weakened than during the Cold War, and especially after China normalized its relations with South Korea. North Koreans are very much angry on the Chinese decision. So there has been some kind of great disappointment or awakening in North Korean part that they cannot completely trust Chinese promise of committing into the North Korean defense, as China did during the Korean War. In fact, there was quite a sacrifice the Chinese Communist Army, PRA made during the Korean War. So there is always kind of this, marriage of convenience between China and North Korea. They were allied because they need each other, especially in terms of the national security. China needs North Korea as a buffer, strategic buffer between their border and the American, military on the South Korean, obviously, which is, by the way, is very much more and increasingly important for China. And second, from North Korean part, obviously, when they were under this US sanction and all kinds of pressure due to their nuclear program, China is the only country who will provide very precious, aid, including, that means most of food, energy, all the other commodity, right? Even today. So China provides basically the lifeline support for this very much isolated North Korean regime. Having said that, still, that doesn't mean that they like each other or they love each other. The sentiment toward each other has becoming growing much more mistrustful. And that's what I heard from many of my Chinese colleagues or some North Korean defectors telling us that North Koreans hate more than they hate Americans. They feel like China is taking advantage of this position, and North Korea feel like China look down on those North Koreans, but just out of necessity, they pretend to be an ally of North Korea. And vice versa, from Chinese perspective, they're not happy North Korean regime creating all kinds of problems. And even for Chinese communist standard, North Korea Kim Jong-un regime is too much of totalitarian in nature, right? So there's a kind of love and hate relationship going on in between those two countries. But at the end of the day, I think for now, their partnership is obviously, they still share the common interest in their regime's security. North Korea, for obviously, unless they have this full normalization with the United States, for which they need to somehow give up their nuclear weapon, which is a kind of impossible situation for North Korea. So for now, North Korea is still sucking up with China. And that's why, the thing is, they've been, when they went to a estranged partnership for like more than almost 10 years. They never met each other between these two leaders, especially since Kim Jong-un came to power. For last 6 or 8 years since Xi Jinping came to power, he never met with any North Korean leader. But then suddenly, over the past 2 years, they met how many times? They met 5 times. So this and Kim Jong-un met with South Korean President Moon Jae-in 4 times. Kim Jong-un met with Donald Trump, American president, 3 times. But still, it was Xi Jinping who met with Kim Jong-un 5 times. So that just tells you the current kind of partnership between China and North Korea. But when it comes to what about Korea and South Korea and China, like I said, but here I wanted to make sure that, you know, the past history, what I explained in my lecture, is just one kind of a reference. Yet at the same time, and that is quite important part of our legacy in Korea and China relationship. Indeed, I think it is very important. But that doesn't mean that you know, past history is the main factor or only factor that defines Korea's attitude or view towards China. Obviously, today's South Korea is very different from Joseon or all the other ancient kingdoms. And today's China is also very different from those pre-modern times. China and Korea both became very much modernized. We are very much influenced by the modern Western nation, modern concept of a nation state is built by Western countries. So in that sense, yes, there are modern sense of strong nationalism, very strongly runs in the Korean society today and as much as in Chinese society. So if there is anything about each other's national sovereignty or territorial issues, we could become very much antagonistic against each other. So we should not definitely be confused about this past historical legacy with also current reality of political and military dynamics on the Korean Peninsula. And of course, in case of Korea, South Korea, we obviously the political idealism system is free democracy. And that is, you know, another very important factors, different factors from the previous historical relationship partnership between Korea and China. And we have to take all those into the consideration. Of course, there are economic dependency of South Korea onto China. That is also another important factor. That's why maybe we try to be nice to China, not because of our history.
Okay, thank you. That is, thank you for that. Now, there are two questions that are going to be taken in from two other faculty, two quick questions there, and then we have 4 students. So I propose that we take the 2 questions from the faculty quickly and then take the next round, we take the 4 students. Vaijayanti would be making her intervention now. Vaijayanti,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening, Professor Sheen. I'm really sorry that earlier on when Dr. Sandeep Mishra introduced me, my audio, you couldn't hear me, though I kept saying yes, hello.
Okay.
Yes.
Now I can hear you.
Yes. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. There were bits where I couldn't get because of, again, internet connection problem. But I hope I'm not sort of asking a question that has been asked, because I don't know what Sudhakar, I heard only bits of what you were. Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh,
There are
yes.
some. Yeah.
Yeah, there is some problem. And my quick question is, yes, I tend to hold a similar view, and was quite happy to note that, you know, by and large, there is stability in East Asia, much more than what the world would like to believe because of the various powers that converge in that region. And China-South Korea relations have always been good, and they continue to be very good. My question is, considering the way China is rising and the aggressiveness it shows in South China Sea, what are South Korea's concerns regarding SLOC, sea lanes of communication, meaning
Yes.
South Korea would be as much affected by it as any other country. And there is no way that China could show concessions only to South Korea, while it's sort of being harsh on the others. So what are South Korea's concerns regarding SLOC?
Okay. Thank you so much.
Take one more question from Sandeep, and you can take both the questions together.
Yes.
Sandeep.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sen, for a very insightful presentation. My question is related to first part of your paper, because actually I largely agree with this proposition that Professor David Kang and others, they have given a new way to look at East Asia. But my slight problem with that idea is that, look, when we are saying that 300 years back, or say 1,000 years back, we had certain kind of that possible, especially last 100 years. My experience shows that most of the countries across the globe, they have acclimatized, they have learned actually the similar categories, similar types of behavior, similar types of interstate relations. So if you look at East Asia, same, you can say, here, there was a slightly, I think 2 days back on Twitter, he had some data about how Korean national identity goes back to say 200, 300, 500, 1,000 years back. So I also wrote a paper in 2011, which I cited. He was happy with that. But my proposition is that, look, we are talking about 1,000 years of interstate relation when different regions in the world, they were not connected that way. Now they are too much connected to each other. And now expecting that has any meaning, like suppose that Japan accept that hierarchical interstate relations, which it accepted, or rather it was okay with, that 200 years back, it need to be explored. And why I'm saying that, because of two reasons. One reason I'm saying that, suppose you mentioned how strong China means okay with East Asia region, stable region. David Kang, one of the propositions, saying that strong China. Think about China. China is strong or weak? Many people say that China is strong economically, militarily, but weak as per domestic problems. How it's going to play out in the regional politics, that also. And thirdly, I will say, second part, that largely in 200 years back, we had limited technological capabilities. So countries, they were satisfied with their, you can say, territorial boundaries if they had enough. Suppose India, most of the big countries in the world, they were satisfied with their boundaries. But right now I see, like India also claimed that we have never conquered, we have never attacked any other country out there. China also said that we are satisfied with our territorial boundaries. So I'm saying that given the technological advancement, countries, they can control larger part. They are having lots of economic resources. Suppose in South China Sea, they have to explore, they have to. So I think, could you tell us how much historical learning is helpful? Because it seems to me that there is a kind of universalization, and I think it doesn't help beyond a point, that framework. Your comment.
Okay, thank you. For me, in fact, I think, Sandeep, your question provide a kind of very bigger framework for me to answer the first question as well. The thing is, South Korea, what is South Korea's position regarding SLOC, sea lanes of communication? That is exactly what we are trying to, there could be a wonderful example of this world is becoming and smaller as countries, economic, all this activity becoming and more bigger and expanding for various reasons. First of all, economically, India is not in and itself cannot be satisfied within its own border. China is the same thing. So you have to engage in world trade and also, of course, you want to also get access to the energy and natural resource. In doing so, there could be some kind of clash, right? And I think that's right. That's a very different situation from those 200 or 300 years back. One of the key reasons why Korea was relatively peaceful was that China didn't need Korean Peninsula. I mean, to me, when I look at it, because China felt like they had everything inside their own big territory. In fact, it was more nuanced than the Korean people keep coming to China. China say, there's nothing we want from you, and you always come to us expecting something from us, right? That used to be the case, but maybe not anymore. Maybe even China may want to something from others, obviously for their economic development, especially in terms of natural resource and energy. That's why they're trying to secure their own sea lines of communication. That one of the main reasons is that the South China Sea, right? But in that regard, I guess, Sandeep, you are right, that we could have a new kind of clash point over this economic trade and over this natural resource and all that. But when it comes to, and that's what's happening, I think, in China and some of the neighboring countries. So it depends, I guess. So South China Sea is an excellent example of that case. Although I think even in South China Sea, the case is more for China's security interests as opposed to vis-a-vis energy or natural resource. But still, South China Sea is a very important sea lines of communication, securing that. And that including the first question, in that regard, South Korea so far does not have much issue with Chinese behavior, at least from the South Korean point of view, because we don't have any issue with our Western Sea, although there is some potential for clash between Chinese fishing interest and the Korean fishing interest. And still, those two governments has been very careful in managing those, the clash at the Western Sea, Korea's Western Sea, and the China calls it Yellow Sea, where there's always overlapping area of Chinese fishermen coming in massive force, and Korean fishermen saying that, oh, they are taking away all our fishing resource from those regions. It used to be the case in several years ago, but recently somehow it didn't rise up to that level. I think Chinese government is making very conscious effort to try to control their fishing activity in those Yellow Sea area. And so we don't have any immediate clash with the Chinese in terms of the sea lines of communication. But when it goes to the South China Sea, which is another important route for South Korea's energy import and trade. But so far, we didn't have any direct kind of interruption by the Chinese activity in South China Sea. So that's why we are a little bit of a kind of trying to be, how should I put it, not to be directly involved in the U.S. effort to, lead a coalition of all those countries in the region in saying that free and open Indo-Pacific, those concepts, right? And so that's so maybe my answer to the first question. But then again, going back to your question about what about the more recent development in terms of all this geography or that, I think there are, yes, some possible potential clash point in that regard. But so far, still, to me, here's one historical lesson that I have, and which I think applies to China is, if that is for economic reason or political influence, I think definitely China could still try to expand its sphere of influence. But still, at the end of the day, when it comes to, let's say, the strategic culture, right? In terms of strategic culture, Chinese always number one priority and concern is how to control its own mainland and population, because it has too much of a diverse group of people and too many people inside China. And trying to control those mainland Chinese continent with stable condition, I think has been always China's number one national security concern. And I think will be still the number one priority. If there is some small island dispute, of course, they will be very much aggressive. But other than it doesn't mean that they're going to try to invade Korean Peninsula or the Japanese archipelago for looking for like a natural resource or new territory. That's just my own. Although, by the way, this is not the general public sentiment. Lots of Korean public tend to imagine that kind of future. If China becomes too powerful, maybe they try to conquer Korean Peninsula. That's so that I have to tell my Korean state, no. If you look at the past history, China is not that much interested in the Korean Peninsula for their own national interest. But obviously, that could be still the minor view only by me. So I don't know whether that is a good answer to you, but I know that there are some others wants to raise a question.
So let me then go to the students. There are 4 students here who have put up there. Oh, there are more. So let me start with Mritika. She followed by Subhasri and then Chandrali. So let's take these 3 questions from these 3. Make them short, pointed questions so that we can have the next round. There are 3 others. Okay, go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mritika?
Yes.
Yes.
Good evening, Professor Sheen, and I would compliment you for a very informative presentation. My question would surround with this point you had made that Korean attitude is not very similar to Japan towards China. And with recently, in your last answer to Professor Sandeep sir's question, you talked about that how Korea would not want to follow US's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. My question would, keeping these things in the backdrop, my question would be, how is South Korea looking at the alliance it shares with US, with specifically the leadership of Donald Trump and let's say the complications which have arisen in the relationship? How would it look at the relationship right now in the present scenario?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll take the other question now from Subhasri.
Audible?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was a very informative and nice experience. My questions are against the backdrop of what Sandeep sir was talking about. If we look at the kind of retaliation that domestic politics produces because of the perception of China being in a partnership with North Korea, what kind of a role will the right wing in South Korea play in this regard? So that, and just a small point I would like to point out, if it is possible, the Joseonjuk population that is residing in South Korea at this point, could they be somehow utilized, despite their very marginal position in Korean society right now, could they be somehow utilized to further this relationship between South Korea and China? That's all.
Okay, thank you.
And one more question we will take in this round from Chandrali.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question, thank you, sir. Thank you for your presentation today. And my question is regarding Abe is pressing for a proactive pacifism, and he's trying to revise Japan's pacifist constitution. So my question is how Korea is perceiving Japan's military enhancement at this point of time.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Yeah, Professor Sheen, you can now address these
Okay.
three, and we'll take one final round.
Okay, excellent. All those are excellent questions and very difficult question. But those are the very relevant, and right now Korea facing important issues with all those three questions. Let me go from the last question. Korea, Japan, or Prime Minister Abe's proactive. And in a way, it has to do with also Indo-Pacific strategy as well. The thing is, yeah, there are two, I can answer this. Again, the Korean general public tend to have a very, very strong misgivings about Japanese policy in general, in particular, Prime Minister Abe's policy. To me, as a kind of expert on these security issues in East Asia, I can understand where Abe's policy coming from. And I see in a way that is very much rational. As much as I see it, North Korea's nuclear development is very rational, right? Not that I agree with or not that I support their decision, but from their perspective, it is quite rational approach. Prime Minister Abe trying to first strengthen the alliance with the United States and also expand those partnerships with other countries, especially democratic countries in Indo-Pacific. And yes, especially that concept of Indo-Pacific itself is an invention of Abe, not Mr. Trump, right? And in that sense, Prime Minister Abe is doing his best to protect Japan's national security interest. But obviously for Korean general public, Prime Minister Abe becoming more proactive or try to modify peace constitution so that Japan becoming more normal in terms of its national security planning and activity is always understood as Japan going back to the military past, which is, I think, is overstatement, which is a very gross misunderstanding about Japan's security policy and situation. I don't think simply Japan go back to the military past, given their demography and economic and alliance partnership with the United States. But Korean general public perception is always very anxious and skeptical about Japanese intention, which is not very good for the Korea-Japan relations. But I think at the same time, there's a good reason why Korean public attitude is like that. That has to do with, yes, Japan's handling of its past history, especially under Prime Minister Abe. They tend to really go grossly not only neglect or deny their own past history, especially with Korea and as well as China. And that create this kind of mistrust or misperception that tend to enhance those misperception among the South Korean society. So that right now translate into the current very difficult relations between Korea and Japan, despite the fact that we two countries are, basically share the same free democratic ideology. We share the same kind of free market and free trade, policy, especially against Mr. Trump's protectionist tendency. So we are the one, and we share the same kind of threat coming out of North Korea's nuclear development. So in that sense, there are lots of areas that Korea and Japan can cooperate, work together. But unfortunately, at the moment, due to this historical issue, and which, by the way, goes back to another element of this constructivist element of international relations, the history, the public sentiment, the images still plays a very important role. And that's the current situation and Korea's attitude towards Abe's proactive defense policy. Goes back to the Joseon족, and you asked two kind of, in a way, different question. One is about Korean, not Korean, Chinese Korean, in Joseon족 anyway, those in Korean ethnic group in Chinese China who came to Korea, worked as immigrant workers in Korean society. They got some special treatment by the Korean government, first of all, out of this Korean nationalism, not nationality, nationalism. But there's a kinds of I think there has been some misperception. These Koreans, ethnic, the Chinese, they are basically Chinese. They came to Korea looking for many economic opportunity. They didn't come to Korea because they want to become a Korean, and because of their Korean nationalism. They feel like they are Chinese, and they act and Chinese, and their loyalty goes to China because they are Chinese citizens. Even especially if they are third generation, only thing is they can speak Korean, they can communicate with Korean, but they are more Chinese than they are Korean, and I think there should be no doubt about it. But yet they could play a certain role in bridging the Korean society with the Chinese part, especially in those northeastern part of China. The question about Korean domestic politics and this current China and US relationship, inter-Korean relations. The thing is, right now, so far over the past almost 70 years, Korean politics has been dominated by the right-wing conservative. Even though the parties has been changed and under the different presidents, but by and large, for past 70 years, since the Korean independence in 1945, Korea's politics has been largely dominated by conservative right-wing politicians, except few cases of progressive government under President Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, and right now Moon Jae-in. But even in the past 10 years of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun presidency, even though the government, the president was progressive politics, but the governing party, majority party in our parliament was always the conservative party, simply because of their popular support. What's happening in Korean politics today, which I think is very interesting, is that for the first time in Korean modern independence history, Korea is becoming more and more, and society as itself is becoming more and more progressive. So that means in lots of economic agenda and social agenda, such as gender and feminist movement and all that. And but one other important impact of that is Korea's perception towards North Korea. Under this conservative right-wing government, North Korea is always been understood as a subject of our kind of mistrust. Or North Korea is being portrayed always, North Korea started the Korean War, tried to invade. I mean, they invaded South Korea literally 70 years ago. So they're the enemy. We cannot coexist, that kind of thing. So bottom line is we got to unify on the South Korean leadership. That means what? We've got to end the North Korean regime. And there's a good also reason. North Korea is not democracy under the totalitarian leadership, under which there's a lot of human rights violation going on. That goes against what South Korea's society represents today. But at the same, yet the recent shift of a kind of rise of progressive politics in Korea means that when it comes to inter-Korean relations, under this current government is more about making peace with North Korea rather than try to unify Korea. And that I think is one of the major shifts in Korea's national security orientation. Of course, we are democracy, and next government could be comeback of right-wing or conservative. In that case, again, our policy orientation towards North Korea will change. But under the current government, it is more about peaceful engagement with North Korea while we try to negotiate nuclear issue. And that has been, I think, widely supported by South Korean public these days. And that's a kind of current situation. Going back to the first alliance issue, that also has to do with this changing domestic dynamics, political dynamics in Korea. In large part, whether conservative or right-wing, Korea still understand, especially the people understand, alliance is the key cornerstone of our national security policy. So alliance is important. So we want to keep, despite the fact that, yeah, we have a growing economic dependence on China, but still our national security depends on alliance. Otherwise, we have to develop our own nuclear weapon. That's the only other alternative. But we know that going for nuclear, like North Korea, is that we becoming also another North Korea. So that's not the path we can take. So the alliance is the key. But the problem to twist is that rise of Trump. And Mr. Trump, you all know that what has been his alliance policy. So that created some difficulty for South Korean government to manage this alliance partnership, such as like a burden sharing demand. The United States is asking, Trump is asking 5 times. It's not even twice as much, it's 5 times of money suddenly, which is unacceptable for us. But despite the fact that under the circumstances, I think the alliance has been managed quite stable. So we are watching very carefully what will happen to this coming election in the United States. And we wish US domestic politics will become much more normal than before.
Thank you. Now we're going to take the last 2 questions from Ananya and Om Prakash, and I think we should conclude after that. So Ananya, come up.
Good evening, Professor Sheen.
Yes.
I'm Ananya Bhardwaj. It was very interactive session. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. So my question is, we all know that US has been always a backbone to South Korea, and these investments and rivalry between US and China over South Korea, don't you think so that it's been a major reason behind South Korea's early development, that South Korea became a developed country much more earlier than other East Asian countries because of these investments and rivalries between US and China? What's your say on this?
Okay, yes. On the next question, please.
Om Prakash.
Hello, sir. I think I am audible.
Yeah.
Hello.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Prakash.
My name is Om Prakash Kumar, and thank you, sir, for your insightful presentation. My question to you: hierarchical Asian order worked well when there was one central power with several peripheral states, but with the condition that central power had no desire of territorial and overweening conditions, and allowed for substantial autonomy and freedom among the lesser states. Based on the above mentioned fact, my question are the following. Do you think that century-old hierarchical Asian order is still relevant in maintaining regional peace and stability in the present era, when there is no impressive international institution to secure the peripheral states' interest from the cunning central powers like China? Second question, do you think that nuclear powerful country like North Korea or India will follow the century-old hierarchical Asian order if it does not help these countries to secure its own interest? Thank you, sir.
Okay. Another excellent 2 questions. Thank you so much. Let me again answer the second question first. The hierarchical order in Asia can be applicable today. No, to me, in fact. We cannot go back to the history. I mean, I cannot imagine that South Korea, paying a quota to China. And I think because we are living in a completely different international system, whether we like it or not. I think the basic concept of current international system is based upon the Western invention of nation-state based international order. That is, each nation, country, no matter how small or big, powerful you are, each country has its own, unwavering national sovereign right that no outside country can intervene, right? Violate. But I think as long as we keep that principle, it is very difficult for me to, China will try to exert its own kind of hierarchical order over other its neighboring country, because I don't think neighboring country will, unless there's a quite forceful measures has been taken under the extraordinary circumstances. Unless that's the case, I don't think Korea or any East Asian country will voluntarily try to pay the quota to China. But and in that sense, yes, this nuclear weapon is another, yes, very important example of that. These days, economically or militarily, even less powerful country can still keep its own national sovereignty independence. It provides very important measure or means to claim its own sovereignty, even at the national security level. Of course, India and Pakistan maybe is a different case, but at least if I look at North Korea, that's the only way. I think in that sense, like I said, it is from North Korean perspective, it's very rational choice. They try to develop a nuclear weapon in facing this huge military disparity between US and South Korean alliance, right? So, but having said that, but still I think one historical lesson or cultural difference between East Asia or China in that sense from other empire in the Western Empire is that I don't think still China will try to be very kind of dominant in terms of politics. Or try to create kind of vassal state in its neighboring country. China, I think, still wants to, maybe they want some respect from others. But other than that, is China trying to intervene in domestic affairs of the country or have some territorial ambition over, except in their boundary. I mean, there could be some territorial dispute between, okay, like you had with China over recent days. And if Korea will unified, we may also have some boundary dispute with China in those current North Korean and China border, because there are some islands, which is very controversial between those two countries. So there could be some kind of such a kind of a boundary issue, but still at the end of the day, I'm not sure whether even if China becomes the #1 hegemony, they will try to go out and conquer other country out of law. That's just my basic assumption. Going back to the first question, and the thing is, what's the secret of Korea's economic success? Yes, I think in that sense, Korea was lucky. And in that sense, Korea is lucky that because Korea is different from Afghanistan. United States stumbled into Afghanistan, and it's been there for how many years? 20 years. In the name of nation building, all that. Nothing has happened, and they are trying to, desperately escape from Afghanistan, which I think will be the case. In that sense, also, Korea is different from South Vietnam, right? US was involved in Vietnam for, again, more than a decade. And then after all, they figured out it's not in their national interest. They just left South Vietnam, and what happened? Vietnam got unified under North Korean leadership, and they went through a quite difficult time. Somehow, United States decided to stay in South Korea since Korean War. For how many years? That's the thing. After 70 years of Korean War, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, 1950. We still have 28,000 American troops on our territory. And until last year, we had the American headquarters, largest military base in the middle of Seoul, the downtown, in the 21st century. I mean, it is understandable if you go to Kabul or if you go to Baghdad at the early stage of war, there was a huge American military headquarters right next to the presidential palace, like in the case of Seoul. But we lived with US alliance for past 70 years. And I think that was one of the key factors that contributed to the first stability of Korean Peninsula. And under that stability, Korea could focus on our economic development. That in and itself is quite a benefit that South Korea took from the alliance with partnership with the United States. But since then, I think from 90s, yes, China has become a major engine of our South Korea's economic growth, especially more so in the 21st century. Right now, South Korea's export depend more than 25% or 27% up to our whole economy go to China, which is bigger than US, our export to US and Japan combined, which is number 2 and number 3. But not only that, South Korea's trade surplus, right, from our export, more than 85% of our trade surplus comes from China. So that tells you how much important the Chinese economy to South Korea. Of course, there are some worry about China's too much dominant upon Korean economy or Chinese, but companies catching up, taking up away South Korea's export market, all those. But bottom line is Chinese market provide huge economic opportunity for Korean economy. And so in that sense, yes, Korea also benefited from Korea's bilateral relations with China in these days. And I wish it will be the case. That's why the last thing Korea wants is the conflict between US and China, because both US and China is very important for South Korea's economy and politics and national security.
Well, thank you. I'll try and switch on the video because it's very unstable, but since we are now wrapping up. So thank you very much, Professor Sheen, for that very, very vibrant and excellent interaction that went on. I think the note on which you concluded that Korea really does not want this major confrontation that is shaping up to take a negative turn.
Yes.
I think a whole lot of countries are keeping their fingers crossed and hoping that this will not get into some kind of a hard, hot war.
Right.
And it remains to be seen how much these small countries are effective in the overall scheme of things. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, even the United States and China, mighty as they are dependent on their linkages with the world. And that includes a whole lot of small countries which are extremely vital in this global economy. And Korea, of course, certainly is a very important player in the global economy. So the whole of Asia, particularly East Asia, Southeast Asia, even in South Asia, we are keeping our fingers crossed that there is no hot war between the US and China. But certainly we need to learn a lot from these engagements that are taking place in East Asia, where despite the difficulties and the complexities, we need to learn some lessons in complex diplomacy, I guess, from your experience and example. So thank you very much. I'm sure our students have benefited greatly. We look forward to a continued association with you. Do send us through Sandeep, or you can just what you write, because we would like to keep up with your very interesting ideas. There were many questions, at least 2 questions I wanted to ask, but I thought it wouldn't be fair that since I was the moderator, I was talking. So maybe some other occasion I would take issues with a couple of points that you made. But on the whole, a very, very interesting session. thank you all very much for being such a great audience and putting up these great questions. And so, Shrabani, over to you to conclude. I think Shrabani,
again, Professor Sheen, for your excellent presentation, which took through the history, brought us to the contemporary world, and then the way you handled the questions which kept pouring in. It shows that how interested the audience was. Thank you again, and we definitely look forward to a more productive interaction with our center. And since you have interest in Japan, in China, as well as in India, maybe sometime you could visit us as a visiting fellow and enrich us with your Korean work. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you. We look forward to the next webinar slated around September next second Thursday. Yeah, second Thursday, I think, is what we do. So we, Professor Sheen, you're always welcome to join us. We will keep sending you the links.
Okay. So, my last word was a word of gratitude. Really, I really myself enjoyed this session with all those great questions and comment. And also, again, thank you so much for the JNU for having me with this great session. And thanks especially Professor, sorry again for my pronunciation, Archaya and Subharini and Professor Sandeep. And it's really, it's my wish someday I could come visit JNU in Delhi and interact with you in person. And until then, both here and India, we can handle all this COVID situation, and I wish we can go back to normalcy as soon as possible. And until then, thank you so much, and I will keep in touch.
Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you.
Yeah. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.